Picture this. You are one of the most powerful men in the ancient world. Your palaces stretch across kingdoms. Your armies number in the tens of thousands. And your very word can end or spare a life. You have literally moved mountains to build monuments that will outlast empires. And yet as you lie in your golden bedchamber, your own body is devouring itself from the inside out. Maggots feast on your rotting flesh while you still breathe. The stench is so overwhelming that even your closest servants can barely stand to be in the same room. You are dying the most horrific death imaginable. And despite all your wealth and power, there is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. This is not fiction. This is not mythology. This is the true story of Herod the Great, King of Judea, a man who literally rotted alive in one of history's most bizarre and terrifying deaths. For over 2,000 years, historians and doctors have puzzled over exactly what killed this legendary ruler. But recent medical detective work has finally solved the mystery, revealing a death so gruesome and so unusual that it reads like something from a horror novel. How does a king who commanded the loyalty of millions end up in such a state? What caused his body to turn against him in such a brutal way? And why did ancient writers describe his death as divine punishment for his countless crimes? The answers to these questions take us into a world of palace intrigue, religious persecution, family murder, and medical horrors that will challenge everything you think you know about power, mortality, and justice. This is the story of a man who built some of the greatest architectural wonders of the ancient world, including the magnificent expansion of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. A man who dined with Roman emperors and shaped the destiny of nations. A man whose name has echoed through history for over 2 millennia. And yet, when his time came to die, he experienced something so awful that it defied all logic and reason. Prepare yourself for a journey into one of history's most disturbing medical mysteries. This is the bizarre case of the king who rotted alive. Our story begins in the 1st century before Christ, in a land that has been the crossroads of civilizations for thousands of years. The Eastern Mediterranean is a powder keg of competing powers, shifting alliances, and religious tensions. The mighty Roman Republic is expanding its reach across the known world, but it has not yet become the all-conquering empire of later centuries. In this volatile landscape stands the Kingdom of Judea, a small but strategically crucial territory that sits at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Into this world is born a man who will become known as Herod the Great, but his path to greatness is anything but straightforward. Herod is not born into royalty. He is not even fully Jewish, which in a kingdom founded on religious identity creates immediate problems. His father Antipater is an Idumean, a member of a people that had been forcibly converted to Judaism just generations earlier. To many Jews, this makes Herod's family little better than foreigners, pretending to be chosen people. But what Herod lacks in bloodline, he makes up for in cunning, ambition, and an almost supernatural ability to pick the winning side in political conflicts. From his earliest days, he demonstrates a talent for reading people and situations that borders on genius. He understands that in a world where empires rise and fall with frightening speed, survival depends not on loyalty to any particular cause, but on the ability to adapt and ally yourself with whoever holds real power. Herod's rise to power reads like a masterclass in political maneuvering. When civil war tears through the Roman Republic, he carefully studies the major players and throws his support behind the eventual winners. When Mark Antony and Octavian divide the Roman world between them, Herod manages to maintain good relations with both. When Octavian finally defeats Antony and becomes Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, Herod seamlessly transitions his loyalty to the new regime. But perhaps most impressively, Herod manages to convince Augustus that despite being a client king rather than a Roman citizen, he is absolutely essential to Roman interests in the region. He presents himself as the perfect buffer between the Roman Empire and the potentially rebellious Jewish population. He can speak their language, understand their customs, and keep them in line while ensuring that Roman taxes flow smoothly into imperial coffers. The strategy works brilliantly. Augustus not only confirms Herod as king of Judea, but actually expands his territories, making him ruler over a kingdom that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River and beyond. For the first time in centuries, the Jewish people are united under a single ruler who commands real respect from the dominant world power. And Herod does not waste this opportunity. He launches a building program that transforms his kingdom into one of the architectural marvels of the ancient world. The crown jewel of his projects is the expansion and renovation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The temple that emerges from Herod's construction is not just a place of worship, but a wonder of engineering and artistry that draws visitors from across the known world. The numbers alone are staggering. The Temple Mount platform that Herod creates covers 35 acres, making it one of the largest religious complexes in the ancient world. The retaining walls require stones so massive that they boggle the mind. Some of these blocks weigh over 500 tons. Moving them into place without modern machinery represents a feat of engineering that challenges our understanding of ancient technology. But Herod's building ambitions extend far beyond the temple. He constructs the port city of Caesarea Maritima, complete with an artificial harbor that rivals anything built by Rome itself. He builds palaces, fortresses, theaters, and amphitheaters. He creates entire cities from scratch. Everywhere you look in his kingdom, you see evidence of a man determined to leave his mark on history through stone and mortar. These construction projects serve multiple purposes beyond mere vanity. They provide employment for thousands of workers, keeping the population busy and prosperous. They demonstrate Herod's power and wealth to both his subjects and foreign visitors. Most importantly, they show his commitment to both Jewish and Roman culture, helping him maintain his delicate balancing act between two very different worlds. To his Jewish subjects, Herod presents himself as a pious king who honors their religious traditions. The temple expansion is the ultimate expression of this persona. He strictly observes Jewish law during the construction, ensuring that only priests handle the most sacred work. He uses only the finest materials and the most skilled craftsmen. The result is a building that even his harshest critics must admit is truly magnificent. To his Roman patrons, Herod presents himself as a cultured Hellenistic monarch who appreciates the finer things in life. His palaces feature Roman architectural elements. His cities include theaters and racetracks for Roman-style entertainment. And his court adopts many Roman customs. He regularly hosts Roman officials and provides them with the kind of luxury and sophistication they expect from a civilized ruler. This dual identity requires constant vigilance and careful calculation. Herod must be Jewish enough to maintain legitimacy with his subjects, but Roman enough to keep his imperial patrons happy. He must show respect for Jewish religious sensibilities while also embracing the cosmopolitan culture that Romans associate with proper civilization. It is a balancing act that would challenge even the most skilled diplomat. For many years, Herod manages this impossible task with remarkable success. His kingdom enjoys unprecedented prosperity and stability. Trade flourishes, construction booms, and for the first time in generations, Jews can practice their religion without fear of persecution or interference. Pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world travel to Jerusalem to worship at Herod's magnificent temple, bringing wealth and prestige to the kingdom. But beneath this surface prosperity, tensions are building that will eventually tear Herod's kingdom apart. Many religious Jews never fully accept his legitimacy, viewing him as a foreign usurper who has imposed himself on God's chosen people through Roman backing. They particularly resent his attempts to introduce Hellenistic culture into Jewish life, seeing this as a betrayal of their ancestors' faith. More troubling still, Herod's own family becomes a battlefield of competing ambitions and deadly rivalries. As a polygamist with multiple wives, he fathers numerous children who view each other as obstacles to their own advancement. His wives scheme against each other's children, each hoping to position her own offspring as the future king. The palace becomes a nest of intrigue, where paranoia and suspicion flourish like poisonous plants. And at the center of it all stands Herod himself, growing increasingly isolated and suspicious as he ages. The man who once navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics with such skill begins to see enemies everywhere. He starts to believe that everyone around him, including his own family members, is plotting his downfall. What begins as reasonable caution gradually transforms into something much darker and more dangerous. The first signs of Herod's descent into murderous paranoia appear relatively early in his reign, when he suspects that his brother-in-law, Aristobulus, might be positioning himself as a rival claimant to the throne. Herod arranges for the young man to be drowned in what is made to look like an accident. The death occurs during a party at one of Herod's palaces, where Aristobulus is allegedly pushed underwater by playful friends and held down just a little too long. The incident sends a clear message to anyone who might challenge Herod's authority, but it also marks the beginning of a pattern that will define the later years of his reign. Whenever Herod perceives a threat, real or imagined, his response is swift and brutal. He does not hesitate to eliminate anyone who might potentially oppose him, even if that person is a member of his own family. This paranoid streak becomes particularly pronounced when it comes to his relationship with his wife, Mariamne, a woman of genuine Hasmonean royal blood whose lineage gives her children a stronger claim to the Jewish throne than Herod himself possesses. Herod is genuinely in love with Mariamne, but he is also deeply suspicious of her motivations and those of her family. He constantly worries that she is plotting against him, or encouraging others to do so. The situation reaches a breaking point when Herod becomes convinced that Mariamne has committed adultery and is working with his enemies to overthrow him. Whether these suspicions have any basis in reality is impossible to determine from the historical record, but Herod is absolutely convinced of her guilt. In a fit of rage and paranoia, he orders her execution, along with her mother and several other family members who he believes are part of the alleged conspiracy. The murder of Mariamne marks a turning point in Herod's psychological state. Almost immediately after her death, he is overcome with remorse and grief. He begins talking to her as if she were still alive, ordering servants to summon her to his presence. When they gently remind him that she is dead, he flies into violent rages that terrify everyone around him. The guilt and loss eat away at his sanity, transforming him from a calculating politician into an increasingly unstable tyrant. But if Herod thinks that eliminating Mariamne will solve his problems, he is tragically mistaken. Her death only makes his paranoia worse, because now he must live with the knowledge that he has murdered the woman he loved most in the world, based on suspicions that may have been completely unfounded. The guilt consumes him, but rather than moderating his behavior, it drives him to even greater acts of violence. Over the following years, Herod's list of victims grows longer and more shocking. He orders the execution of two of his own sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, whom he suspects of plotting revenge for their mother's death. He has numerous palace officials and military commanders killed on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. He eliminates entire branches of his extended family tree, always convinced that he is defending himself against imminent threats. The executions create a climate of terror that permeates every level of Herod's kingdom. No one feels safe, because no one knows who might be next to fall under suspicion. Palace officials walk on eggshells, afraid that any word or action might be misinterpreted as treasonous. Military commanders hesitate to show too much competence, lest they be seen as potential rivals. Even Herod's remaining family members live in constant fear, knowing that blood relationship provides no protection against his paranoid suspicions. This reign of terror reaches its most infamous peak in the final years of Herod's life, when he becomes convinced that a newborn child somewhere in his kingdom poses a mortal threat to his dynasty. According to historical accounts, Herod learns of prophecies suggesting that a new king has been born among the Jews, someone destined to replace him on the throne. Rather than investigating these claims rationally, Herod responds with characteristic brutality. The result is one of history's most notorious massacres. Herod orders the execution of all male children under the age of 2 in and around Bethlehem, hoping to eliminate this prophesied rival before he can grow up to challenge royal authority. The slaughter is methodical and thorough, carried out by soldiers who show no mercy to pleading mothers or innocent infants. It is an act of such monstrous cruelty that it cements Herod's reputation as one of history's most ruthless tyrants. But even as Herod lashes out at his perceived enemies with increasing violence, his own body is beginning to betray him in ways that will ultimately prove far more devastating than any external threat. The first signs are subtle. Occasional stomach pains, periods of unusual fatigue, minor skin irritations that seem to take longer than usual to heal. These symptoms are easy to dismiss as the normal effects of aging and stress, especially for a man who has lived such an intense and demanding life. However, as months pass, these minor complaints begin to worsen, and new symptoms appear. Herod starts experiencing severe itching that keeps him awake at night, scratching until his skin bleeds. He develops breathing problems that make it difficult for him to speak for long periods or climb stairs without becoming winded. His appetite decreases, and he begins to lose weight despite having access to the finest foods in his kingdom. Most troubling of all, Herod begins to notice problems with his genitals. What starts as minor irritation gradually becomes painful swelling, followed by the development of open sores that refuse to heal properly. The area becomes increasingly painful and begins to emit a foul odor that no amount of bathing or perfume can disguise. Palace physicians try various treatments, but nothing seems to help, and the condition continues to deteriorate. As Herod's physical health declines, his mental state becomes even more unstable. The constant pain and discomfort make him irritable and unpredictable. His paranoid suspicions intensify, and he becomes convinced that his illness is not natural, but has been caused by enemies who are somehow poisoning him or casting spells against him. This belief leads to even more violent purges as he tries to eliminate anyone who might be responsible for his suffering. The combination of physical agony and mental anguish creates a vicious cycle that accelerates Herod's decline. The worse he feels, the more convinced he becomes that he's under attack, leading to more executions and more stress, which in turn worsens his physical symptoms. Palace life becomes a nightmare of unpredictable violence and fear, as no one knows what might trigger the king's next outburst of rage. Herod's physicians, the best medical minds available in the ancient world, are completely baffled by his condition. They try every treatment known to their profession: herbal remedies, dietary changes, bloodletting, purging, and various forms of physical therapy. Nothing provides more than temporary relief, and some treatments seem to make the symptoms worse. The doctors begin to whisper among themselves that the king's illness is beyond their ability to cure. As word of Herod's condition spreads beyond the palace walls, it takes on an almost supernatural significance in the minds of his subjects. Many interpret his mysterious illness as divine punishment for his countless crimes, particularly the massacre of the innocents and the murder of his own family members. Religious leaders speak of God's justice finally catching up with the tyrant king, while common people see poetic justice in the fact that a man who caused so much suffering is now experiencing unimaginable agony himself. The progression of Herod's illness follows a pattern that modern medical experts have been able to analyze in detail, thanks to the comprehensive accounts left by ancient historians. The most detailed description comes from Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian who had access to eyewitness accounts and official records from Herod's court. His descriptions of the king's final months provide a clinical picture of symptoms that allows modern doctors to make educated guesses about the underlying medical condition. According to Josephus, Herod's suffering intensified dramatically in his final year. The itching became so severe that he would claw at his skin until it bled, leaving open wounds that became infected and added to his misery. His breathing problems worsened to the point where he could barely speak above a whisper. and he had to be propped up in bed to avoid suffocating. His feet and legs swelled with fluid retention, making it impossible for him to walk without assistance. But the most horrifying aspect of Herod's condition was what was happening to his genitals. The swelling increased to grotesque proportions, and the skin began to break down and rot while he was still alive. The smell became so overwhelming that servants could barely enter his presence, even with cloths soaked in perfume pressed to them. Worst of all, the rotting flesh began to attract insects, and maggots actually began feeding on his body while he still lived and breathed. Imagine the psychological horror of this situation. Herod, once the most powerful man in his world, is reduced to lying helpless in his own filth, while his body literally consumes itself. The pain is constant and excruciating, but the humiliation may be even worse. The man who once commanded armies and built magnificent cities is now too weak to prevent insects from eating his flesh. The stench is so bad that even his closest family members can barely stand to visit him. This is not merely a medical condition, but a complete breakdown of human dignity. Everything that made Herod who he was, all his power and authority and pride, is stripped away by the relentless progression of his disease. He becomes an object of revulsion rather than respect, dependent on the care of servants who must steel themselves to enter his presence. The psychological torment of this situation is almost impossible to imagine. As Herod's condition deteriorates, palace life becomes increasingly chaotic. With the king incapacitated and his succession unclear, various family members and political factions begin positioning themselves for the power struggle that will inevitably follow his death. Courtiers who once competed for his favor now compete to avoid being blamed for his condition or accused of hastening his demise. The kingdom itself begins to show signs of the instability that comes when strong central authority breaks down. Local officials become less responsive to royal commands, knowing that the king is in no condition to enforce his will. Tax collection becomes sporadic, and some regions begin acting with increasing independence. Religious tensions, always present under Herod's rule, begin to intensify as various groups prepare for the changes that will come with a new ruler. But Herod is not ready to die, despite his body's deterioration. His willpower, the same iron determination that carried him from obscurity to the throne, now focuses entirely on staying alive long enough to secure his legacy and ensure an orderly succession. He dictates new versions of his will, changing his designated heirs based on his shifting, paranoid suspicions about which of his surviving sons can be trusted with power. The process of dying becomes a political act, as every decision Herod makes about his treatment, his will, or his funeral arrangements carries implications for the future of his kingdom. Palace physicians find themselves caught between their medical responsibilities and the political pressures surrounding their patient. Giving up on treatment might be seen as treason, but continued failed attempts at cure only highlight their helplessness in the face of the king's mysterious condition. In his lucid moments, Herod seems to understand that his illness has taken on symbolic significance far beyond its medical reality. He realizes that the manner of his death will be interpreted as either divine justice or tragic misfortune, depending on the observer's political and religious perspectives. This awareness adds another layer of torment to his suffering, as he knows that his enemies will see his agony as proof that their opposition to his rule was justified all along. Religious leaders throughout his kingdom begin to speak more openly about the connection between Herod's crimes and his suffering. They point to biblical precedents where wicked rulers were struck down by divine punishment, often in ways that seemed specifically designed to match their particular sins. The fact that Herod's condition involves the rotting of his flesh while he still lives is seen as particularly significant, suggesting that he is experiencing a foretaste of the torments that await him in the afterlife. These religious interpretations of his illness add to Herod's mental anguish, because despite his adoption of Hellenistic culture and his political alliances with pagan Romans, he remains fundamentally a believer in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He cannot dismiss the possibility that his suffering really is divine punishment, which means that no earthly treatment will be effective. If God has decided to punish him for his sins, then all the physicians and medicines in the world cannot save him. This spiritual dimension of his illness may actually worsen his physical symptoms, as the stress and despair of believing himself abandoned by God take their toll on his already weakened body. Modern medicine recognizes the powerful connection between mental state and physical health, and there is no doubt that Herod's psychological torment contributed to his physical decline. As his final months drag on, Herod's appearance becomes so shocking that even hardened courtiers have difficulty looking at him directly. The once proud king, who took such care with his appearance and dress, is reduced to a skeletal figure whose body is literally falling apart. His face is gaunt and gray, his eyes sunken and wild with pain and madness. The smell that emanates from his rotting flesh is so powerful that it seems to cling to anyone who enters his presence. Palace servants develop elaborate protocols for dealing with their dying king, including systems of rotating duties, so that no individual has to endure prolonged exposure to his condition. They burn incense constantly in his chambers, not just to mask the smell, but because they believe it might have some purifying effect. Everything that comes into contact with Herod must be thoroughly cleaned or destroyed afterward, creating a massive burden on the palace household. The economic impact of Herod's illness extends far beyond the palace walls. His inability to govern effectively creates uncertainty that affects trade and commerce throughout his kingdom. Merchants hesitate to make long-term investments when they cannot predict who will rule or what policies will be in place after the king's death. Agricultural planning becomes difficult when farmers do not know what taxes they will face or whether their land tenure will be secure under a new ruler. International relations also suffer as foreign governments and trading partners lose confidence in the stability of Herod's kingdom. Roman officials begin making contingency plans for direct imperial administration of Judea, while neighboring rulers consider whether they might be able to seize territory or influence during the transition period. The weakness of a single man creates ripple effects that touch thousands of lives across the region. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Herod's prolonged dying is the way it affects his relationships with his surviving family members. The combination of his paranoid suspicions and their own fears for their safety creates an atmosphere where genuine human connection becomes almost impossible. Family visits become formal. Guarded affairs, where every word is carefully calculated to avoid triggering accusations of disloyalty or conspiracy. His sons, who should be providing comfort and support during his final illness, instead find themselves walking a tightrope between filial duty and self-preservation. They must show enough concern to avoid being accused of wanting their father dead, but not so much devotion that they might be suspected of plotting to hasten his death for political advantage. The natural grief and anxiety that comes with watching a parent die is complicated by the very real fear that any misstep might result in their own execution. This family dysfunction reaches its peak when Herod, in one of his final acts as king, orders the execution of another of his sons, Antipater, whom he has become convinced is plotting against him. The execution takes place just days before Herod's own death, making it seem like a final spasm of the paranoid violence that has defined his later years. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Antipater may well have been innocent of any real conspiracy, making his death a senseless waste that achieves nothing except the satisfaction of his father's distorted suspicions. The psychological impact of watching Herod die in such a horrible manner extends beyond his immediate family to affect everyone who knew him. Courtiers, who spent years learning to read his moods and anticipate his needs, now watch helplessly as his mind deteriorates along with his body. Military commanders, who once executed his orders without question, now witness the complete breakdown of the authority they once served. Palace servants, who took pride in maintaining the dignity and splendor of the royal court, now struggle to provide basic care for a man whose condition defies all normal protocols of royal service. The contrast between Herod's current state and his former glory makes his decline even more shocking to observe. People who remember him as a vigorous leader who could charm Roman senators and intimidate rebellious subjects now see him reduced to a barely human figure, consumed by disease and madness. The transformation is so complete that it seems almost supernatural, lending credibility to religious explanations that interpret his suffering as divine intervention rather than natural illness. Modern medical experts who have studied the historical accounts of Herod's death have reached a remarkable consensus about what killed him. The combination of symptoms described by ancient historians points to a specific medical condition that explains not just how he died, but why his death was so uniquely horrible. The diagnosis is chronic kidney disease, complicated by a condition called Fournier's gangrene, a rare but devastating bacterial infection that affects the genital area. Chronic kidney disease would explain many of Herod's symptoms, including the fluid retention that caused swelling in his feet and legs, the breathing difficulties that resulted from fluid buildup in his lungs, and the general deterioration of his health over many months. As his kidneys failed to filter toxins from his blood, these poisons would have accumulated in his system, causing the confusion and altered mental state that witnesses described. But it is the secondary condition, Fournier's gangrene, that accounts for the most horrific aspects of Herod's death. This bacterial infection causes rapid tissue death in the genital area, creating exactly the kind of rotting flesh and overwhelming stench that ancient historians describe. The infection is particularly dangerous because it spreads quickly and is extremely difficult to treat, even with modern antibiotics. In the ancient world, it would have been invariably fatal. The presence of maggots in Herod's rotting flesh, while horrifying to contemplate, actually makes perfect medical sense. Flies are naturally attracted to decomposing tissue, and they lay their eggs in wounds and infected areas. The maggots that hatch from these eggs feed on dead and dying tissue, which explains why they were present while Herod was still alive. In a grim irony, the maggots may actually have helped prevent even worse complications by consuming infected tissue that might otherwise have led to blood poisoning. The combination of kidney failure and Fournier's gangrene explains why Herod's death was so prolonged and agonizing. Either condition alone might have killed him relatively quickly, but together they created a medical nightmare that dragged on for months. His kidneys were failing slowly enough to keep him alive, but not functioning well enough to help his body fight off the spreading infection. The result was a death that was both inevitable and unbearably drawn out. This medical explanation for Herod's death helps us understand why ancient observers found it so shocking and significant. Even in a world where life expectancy was short and medical knowledge was primitive, people recognized that what was happening to Herod was extraordinarily unusual. The specific combination of symptoms, the prolonged nature of his suffering, and the particularly disgusting aspects of his condition all combined to create something that seemed to transcend normal human experience. The fact that modern medicine can explain Herod's death does not diminish its historical significance or its impact on the people who witnessed it. To his contemporaries, watching a king die in such a manner was a profound spiritual and political event that demanded explanation and interpretation. The medical reality behind his symptoms does not invalidate the religious and philosophical meanings that people found in his suffering. Understanding the medical cause of Herod's death also helps explain why it became such a powerful symbol in later historical and religious tradition. The image of a tyrant literally rotting alive while still conscious speaks to fundamental human concerns about justice, mortality, and the limits of earthly power. Even if we know that his condition resulted from bacterial infection rather than divine intervention, the symbolism remains powerful and relevant. The final weeks of Herod's life unfold like scenes from a nightmare as his condition deteriorates beyond anything that modern imagination can easily grasp. The king who once commanded respect and fear from subjects across his kingdom is now unable to control his own bodily functions. Palace servants must constantly change his bedding and clothing, struggling to maintain even basic cleanliness in the face of his body's breakdown. The smell emanating from Herod's chambers becomes so overwhelming that it spreads throughout the palace, despite all efforts to contain it. Visitors can detect the odor of death and decay from corridors away from his room, creating an atmosphere of dread and revulsion that affects everyone in the building. Some courtiers and family members begin wearing perfumed cloths over their faces whenever they venture into that part of the palace. But even these precautions provide only limited relief. Herod's mental state during these final weeks fluctuates between periods of relative clarity and episodes of complete delirium. During his lucid moments, he seems acutely aware of his condition and the horror it represents. He rages against his helplessness, demanding that his physicians do something to restore his dignity and power. When they admit their inability to help him, he sometimes falls into deep depressions that are almost as painful to witness as his physical agony. In his delirious periods, Herod's mind returns to the events and people that have defined his reign. He holds conversations with dead family members, particularly his murdered wife, Mariamne, sometimes apologizing for his actions and sometimes justifying them with paranoid explanations about conspiracies and betrayals. He gives orders to servants and soldiers who are not there, attempting to command armies that exist only in his fevered imagination. These episodes of delirium provide disturbing insights into Herod's psychological state during his final decline. The guilt and paranoia that drove him to commit so many violent acts clearly continue to torment him, even as his body fails. So, rather than finding peace or acceptance in his dying moments, he seems trapped in an endless cycle of reliving his worst decisions and their terrible consequences. The practical challenges of caring for Herod during this period are almost insurmountable. No amount of medical knowledge or royal wealth can address the basic problem of keeping him comfortable and clean when his body is literally decomposing while he lives. Palace physicians exhaust their knowledge and resources trying various treatments, but everything they attempt either fails to help or actually makes his condition worse. Religious authorities begin to visit the palace more frequently as word spreads that the king's death is imminent. Some come to offer spiritual comfort, while others seem more interested in confirming that divine justice is finally being served. Their presence adds another layer of complexity to the palace dynamics, as Herod's family and advisors must balance respect for religious leaders with concerns about what messages these visits might send to the broader population. The question of succession becomes increasingly urgent as Herod's condition worsens. His most recent will names his son Archelaus as his primary heir, but the document has been changed so many times that its legitimacy is questionable. Other family members and political factions begin positioning themselves for the power struggle that will inevitably follow his death, leading to conspiracies and alliances that further complicate the already tense atmosphere. Roman officials in the region begin making discreet preparations for various scenarios that might unfold after Herod's death. They are particularly concerned about the possibility of civil war between competing claimants to the throne, which could destabilize the entire region and threaten Rome. Some begin quietly suggesting that direct imperial administration might be preferable to continued client kingship under Herod's fractured dynasty. The broader population of Herod's kingdom watches these developments with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Many look forward to the end of his reign, hoping that a new ruler might be less oppressive and paranoid. But they also worry about the instability that could come with a contested succession, remembering the chaos and violence that accompanied previous transitions of power in the region. Trade and commerce throughout the kingdom continue to suffer as merchants and farmers struggle to plan for an uncertain future. Some begin hoarding goods and currency, while others try to liquidate their assets before potential upheavals make them worthless. The economic disruption caused by one man's illness demonstrates how completely the ancient world depended on the health and stability of individual rulers. International observers also watch Herod's decline with great interest, as his death could have implications far beyond the borders of Judea. Neighboring kingdoms consider whether they might be able to expand their territories or influence during the transition period. And the balance of power in the region hangs in the balance, while distant powers evaluate how changes in the region might affect their own strategic interests. As Herod enters what will prove to be his final days, his physical condition reaches levels of horror that challenge description. The infection in his genital area has spread to other parts of his body, creating additional sites of rotting flesh that attract more insects and add to the overwhelming stench. His breathing becomes so labored that each breath requires visible effort, and his voice is reduced to barely audible whispers. The psychological impact of watching Herod die in this manner extends far beyond his immediate circle to affect everyone who hears about his condition. Servants who once competed for the privilege of serving the king now draw lots to determine who must enter his presence, and even the winners of these grim lotteries often emerge from his chambers physically ill from the experience. Palace guards, hardened soldiers who have witnessed battlefield carnage and urban violence, find themselves unable to maintain their composure when assigned to duty outside Herod's chambers. The sounds that emerge from his room, the constant moaning and occasional screams of pain, combined with the pervasive smell of death, create an atmosphere that tests the limits of human endurance. Family members who still visit Herod during his final days describe an experience that haunts them for the rest of their lives. The man they once knew as a powerful and charismatic leader has been reduced to something barely recognizable as human. His physical transformation is so complete that some struggle to believe they are looking at the same person who once commanded their respect and fear. The contrast between Herod's current condition and his former glory becomes a subject of philosophical reflection for ancient writers and thinkers. Here is a man who seemed to have achieved everything that worldly ambition could desire: power, wealth, fame, and the ability to shape history according to his will. Yet all of these achievements prove completely worthless when confronted with the reality of physical mortality and divine justice. This theme of the vanity of earthly power in the face of death becomes a central element in how later generations remember and interpret Herod's story. Religious writers in particular use his death as an example of how God humbles the proud and brings down the mighty from their thrones. The irony of Herod's situation becomes even more profound when we consider what he is losing as his body fails. This is not just any dying man, but someone who has spent his entire adult life accumulating and wielding power on a scale that few humans in history have ever achieved. He has literally moved mountains to build his monuments, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of subjects, and sat as an equal at tables with Roman emperors. Now, he cannot even command his own body to stop rotting while he still lives. The psychological torture of this reversal of fortune may be even worse than the physical pain he endures. Herod's entire identity has been built around his ability to control people and events through force of will, political cunning, and sheer determination. He has never accepted defeat in any meaningful sense, always finding ways to turn apparent setbacks into opportunities for greater triumph. But against this enemy, this bacterial infection eating away at his flesh, all his skills and resources are completely useless. In his more lucid moments, Herod seems to grasp the cosmic significance of what is happening to him. He understands that his death will be remembered not as the peaceful passing of a great king, but as a horrific spectacle that validates every criticism his enemies have ever made about his reign. The manner of his dying threatens to overshadow all of his achievements, reducing his legacy to a cautionary tale about the dangers of tyranny and the inevitability of divine justice. This awareness adds another dimension to his suffering, because Herod has always been acutely conscious of how history will remember him. His massive building projects, his careful cultivation of relationships with Roman leaders, his efforts to balance Jewish religious sensibilities with Hellenistic cultural expectations, all of these have been motivated at least partly by his desire to be remembered as a great king rather than a mere puppet ruler imposed by foreign conquerors. But now, as he lies helpless in his own filth while maggots consume his flesh, Herod realizes that all of his careful legacy management has been undone by the simple biological reality of bacterial infection. Future generations will not remember him primarily for the magnificence of his temple or the engineering marvels of his cities, but for the disgusting manner of his death and what it seemed to reveal about divine judgment on earthly tyranny. The final days of Herod's life unfold with agonizing slowness as his body clings to life despite the advanced state of its decomposition. Palace physicians, who have long since abandoned any hope of cure, now focus entirely on trying to make his remaining time as bearable as possible. They experiment with various combinations of pain-relieving herbs and drugs, but nothing seems capable of providing significant relief from his constant agony. The logistics of caring for a dying king whose body is literally falling apart present challenges that no royal protocol has ever anticipated. Servants must be rotated frequently to prevent them from becoming physically ill from prolonged exposure to the smell and sight of his condition. Special arrangements must be made for disposing of bedding and clothing that becomes contaminated with infected fluids and decomposing tissue. Even the basic question of who should be present during Herod's final moments becomes politically complicated. Family members, who might normally be expected to maintain a bedside vigil, find themselves unable to endure more than brief visits. Court officials, who should be recording his final words and wishes, struggle to understand his whispered communications through the cloth masks they must wear to filter the air. The symbolic significance of Herod's condition becomes a topic of intense discussion throughout his kingdom and beyond. Religious leaders debate whether his suffering represents divine punishment for specific sins or a more general judgment on the corrupting nature of absolute power. Political observers consider what lessons his death might hold for other rulers who have governed through fear and violence. Some interpret his condition as proof that there are moral limits to what even the most powerful rulers can get away with. suggesting that divine justice eventually catches up with tyrants, no matter how successfully they seem to escape earthly consequences for their actions. Others see his death as a reminder of the fundamental equality of all humans in the face of mortality, regardless of their worldly status or achievements. These philosophical and religious interpretations of Herod's death take on added significance because of the timing of his final illness. His decline coincides with growing religious and political tensions throughout his kingdom, as various groups prepare for the changes that will inevitably follow his death. The manner of his dying becomes entangled with broader questions about legitimate authority, divine favor, and the future direction of Jewish society. The international implications of Herod's prolonged dying also become increasingly apparent as his condition worsens. Roman officials must balance their respect for their client king with their practical need to prepare for succession scenarios that might threaten imperial interests in the region. They begin holding discreet meetings with various potential heirs, trying to determine which candidates might be most reliable in maintaining the stability and loyalty that Rome requires. Neighboring kingdoms and tribal groups also monitor developments in Judea with great interest, as Herod's death could create opportunities for territorial expansion or political influence that have been impossible during his strong rule. Some begin making preliminary military preparations, positioning forces near their borders with Herod's kingdom in case chaos erupts during the succession process. The economic disruption caused by uncertainty about Herod's succession continues to ripple throughout the region, affecting trade routes, currency exchange rates, and agricultural planning. Merchants who have built their businesses around the stability and prosperity of Herod's reign now face the prospect of operating in a much more uncertain environment under whoever succeeds him. As Herod's death approaches, the question of his funeral arrangements becomes another source of controversy and complexity. Normally, the death of a great king would be marked by elaborate ceremonies designed to honor his achievements and demonstrate the continuity of royal authority. But how do you organize a dignified funeral for a man whose body has decomposed while he still lived? How do you maintain royal protocol when the deceased's condition makes traditional practices impossible? Palace officials struggle with these unprecedented challenges while trying to balance competing demands from family members, religious authorities, and Roman representatives who all have different ideas about how Herod's death should be handled. The need to dispose of his body quickly for health reasons conflicts with expectations for elaborate mourning periods and ceremonial preparations. The location of Herod's burial also becomes a contentious issue, as various sites carry different political and religious implications. Some argue for burial in Jerusalem, near the temple he expanded, while others prefer locations that emphasize his connection to Roman culture and international achievements. Each choice sends messages about how his reign should be remembered and what values his successors plan to emphasize. Throughout these final days, Herod himself drifts in and out of consciousness, sometimes seeming aware of the discussions taking place around his bedside, and sometimes lost in feverish delusions that transport him back to earlier periods of his life. When he is alert enough to communicate, his words often focus on practical concerns about succession and the security of his kingdom, showing that even in his extremity, he remains focused on political calculations. But he also experiences moments of what seems like genuine remorse for some of his actions, particularly the murders of family members who may have been innocent of the conspiracies he suspected them of planning. These expressions of regret are fragmentary and difficult to interpret, filtered through pain and medication and the deteriorating condition of his mind. But they suggest that he retains some capacity for moral reflection, even as his body fails. The contrast between these glimpses of possible repentance and the continued political maneuvering of his final days illustrates the complexity of Herod's character and the impossibility of reducing him to simple categories of good or evil. Even as he lies dying in the most horrible circumstances imaginable, he remains simultaneously a calculating politician, a guilt-ridden murderer, a devoted father to some of his children, and a visionary builder whose monuments will outlast his mortal flesh. On what proves to be his final day, Herod's condition takes a dramatic turn for the worse. The infection that has been consuming his genital area spreads more rapidly, and his breathing becomes so labored that each breath seems like it might be his last. Palace physicians who have been monitoring his condition around the clock recognize that death is now imminent, probably within hours rather than days. Word spreads quickly through the palace that the end is near, bringing together family members, court officials, and religious leaders who have been waiting for this moment with mixtures of grief, relief, and anticipation. Despite the horrible nature of his condition, many feel obligated to pay their final respects to a man who has dominated their world for over 30 years. The scene in Herod's death chamber defies every conventional expectation about how a great king should die. Instead of being surrounded by dignity and ceremony, he lies in a room that reeks of death and decay, attended by servants who can barely stand to be present, and family members who struggle to hide their revulsion. The man who once commanded the fear and respect of millions is now an object of pity and disgust. Yet even in these final moments, Herod's political instincts remain active. He uses his last conscious hours to finalize arrangements for his succession, making last-minute changes to his will and giving final instructions to the officials who will oversee the transition of power. His voice is barely audible, but his mind remains focused on ensuring that his dynasty will survive his death and continue the work he has begun. As the hours pass, Herod's periods of consciousness become shorter and less frequent. His breathing grows increasingly irregular, and his body temperature drops as his circulation fails. The smell of death that has permeated his chambers for weeks becomes even stronger, as if his body is preparing for the final transition from life to decay. Palace servants who have maintained their vigil despite the horrible conditions begin to whisper prayers and prepare for the practical tasks that will follow his death. Arrangements must be made for washing and preparing his body, though the advanced state of decomposition will make traditional funeral preparations extremely difficult, if not impossible. Family members present at his bedside watch with complex emotions as the man who has shaped their lives through both love and terror finally approaches his end. Some feel genuine grief, for the loss of a father and ruler, while others experience relief that his reign of paranoid violence is finally ending. Most struggle with conflicting feelings that resist easy categorization. Roman officials who have been monitoring the situation prepare to implement contingency plans for maintaining order during the succession process. They know that Herod's death could trigger civil unrest or competing claims to the throne, and they are determined to prevent any disruption that might threaten imperial interests in the region. In the early hours of what will be remembered as one of history's most significant mornings, Herod the Great finally draws his last breath. The man who has defied death through sheer willpower for months finally succumbs to the bacterial infection that has consumed his body from within. His passing is marked not by grand gestures or final speeches, but by the simple cessation of his labored breathing and the gradual stillness that comes with death. The immediate aftermath of Herod's death reveals the full extent of the chaos his illness has created. Palace officials who should be implementing carefully planned succession procedures instead find themselves improvising responses to a situation that no protocol could have anticipated. The condition of his body makes traditional funeral preparations impossible, requiring hasty modifications to ancient customs and religious requirements. News of the king's death spreads throughout his kingdom with remarkable speed, carried by messengers who have been waiting for this moment for weeks. The reaction varies dramatically depending on location and audience, with some communities greeting the news with celebration, while others respond with genuine mourning for a ruler who brought unprecedented prosperity to their region. In Jerusalem, the news triggers immediate concerns about the future of the temple and the religious practices that Herod had both protected and regulated. Religious leaders who had maintained uneasy relationships with the king now face uncertainty about whether his successors will show similar respect for Jewish traditions and customs. Military commanders throughout the kingdom must quickly decide where their loyalties lie, as competing claimants to Herod's throne begin asserting their rights. The succession arrangements outlined in his final will are complicated and ambiguous, creating opportunities for dispute and conflict that threaten to tear the kingdom apart. Roman authorities move quickly to stabilize the situation, making it clear that they will not tolerate any disruption of the peace and order that Herod's rule had maintained. They begin implementing plans for closer imperial oversight of the succession process, effectively reducing the independence that Herod had enjoyed as a client king. The practical challenges of disposing of Herod's body become apparent as soon as death is confirmed. The advanced state of decomposition means that traditional embalming and preparation procedures are impossible, while religious law requires burial within a short time period. Palace officials must find ways to honor both royal dignity and practical necessity while satisfying the competing demands of different religious and cultural traditions. The location chosen for Herod's burial reflects the complexity of his legacy and the political calculations that continue even after his death. Rather than Jerusalem, where his presence might be seen as controversial, his body is transported to the fortress palace of Herodium, a monument to his architectural ambitions that seems appropriate for a king whose greatest achievements were built in stone and mortar. The funeral procession that carries Herod's body to its final resting place becomes a spectacle that reflects both his former glory and the circumstances of his death. The elaborate ceremony required for a king's burial must be balanced against the practical difficulties created by his condition, resulting in a unique event that satisfies neither traditional expectations nor contemporary realities. Along the route of the funeral procession, crowds gather to witness the passing of a ruler who has dominated their world for over 3 decades. Their reactions range from genuine grief to barely concealed celebration, reflecting the complex and contradictory feelings that Herod inspired throughout his reign. Some mourn the loss of a king who brought prosperity and security, while others celebrate the end of a tyrant whose paranoia created years of terror. The international reaction to Herod's death also reveals the extent of his influence beyond the borders of his own kingdom. Roman officials throughout the Eastern Mediterranean must adjust their policies and planning to account for changes in a region that had been stabilized by his strong rule. Neighboring kingdoms recalculate their strategic positions now that a major regional power has lost its long-serving leader. Trade networks that had developed around the stability and prosperity of Herod's kingdom must adapt to new uncertainties about political control and economic policy. Merchants who had built successful businesses serving his construction projects and court must find new opportunities under whatever regime emerges from the succession struggle. The religious implications of Herod's death extend far beyond the immediate political consequences, as his passing marks the end of an era in Jewish history that had been defined by the tension between traditional religious values and Hellenistic cultural influences. His successors will face different challenges in balancing these competing forces, and their choices will shape the development of Jewish society for generations to come. Perhaps most significantly, Herod's death occurs at a moment when religious and political tensions throughout the region are reaching a critical point. His strong rule had suppressed many of these conflicts, but his passing removes a stabilizing force that had prevented various disputes from erupting into open violence. The result is a power vacuum that various groups will attempt to fill according to their own interests and ideologies. The medical mystery of exactly what killed Herod continues to fascinate historians and doctors even today, more than 2,000 years after his death. While modern analysis strongly suggests chronic kidney disease complicated by Fournier's gangrene, the exact sequence of events that led to his condition remains a subject of scholarly debate and investigation. What is not debatable is the impact that the manner of his death had on contemporary observers and later historical interpretation. The image of a powerful king, literally rotting alive, became a powerful symbol of divine justice and the limits of earthly authority that resonated across cultures and centuries. Religious writers, political philosophers, and moral teachers found in Herod's demise a perfect illustration of fundamental truths about power, pride, and mortality. Nothing. The story of Herod's death also provides unique insights into ancient medical knowledge and the limitations that even the most skilled physicians faced when confronting unfamiliar diseases. The detailed accounts left by historians like Josephus give us a clinical picture of symptom progression that allows modern doctors to make informed diagnoses. But they also reveal the helplessness that ancient healers felt when their traditional remedies proved ineffective. The psychological dimensions of Herod's final illness offer another window into the ancient world's understanding of the relationship between mind and body, guilt and physical suffering, political stress and personal health. The connection that contemporary observers drew between his crimes and his condition reflects beliefs about divine justice that were central to ancient religious and philosophical thought. The political consequences of Herod's death proved to be as significant as the medical and religious aspects of his final illness. The succession struggle that followed his passing led to the division of his kingdom among his surviving sons, none of whom proved capable of maintaining the unity and stability that had characterized his reign. Within a few decades, direct Roman rule replaced the client kingship that Herod had represented, marking the end of an experiment in indirect imperial administration. The architectural legacy of Herod's building projects, particularly his expansion of the temple in Jerusalem, continued to influence religious and political life long after his death. The magnificent structure that he created became a focal point for Jewish identity and resistance to Roman rule, ultimately playing a central role in the conflicts that led to the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era. The cultural impact of Herod's reign and death extended far beyond the immediate political and religious consequences, influencing literature, art, and popular imagination for centuries to come. His story became a template for examining the corrupting nature of absolute power and the inevitable consequences of moral compromise in pursuit of political success. Modern historical scholarship has worked to develop a more nuanced understanding of Herod's reign that acknowledges both his genuine achievements and his terrible crimes. While the manner of his death will always overshadow other aspects of his legacy, historians recognize that his rule represented a unique moment in ancient history when Jewish autonomy, Roman imperial interests, and Hellenistic culture intersected in ways that created both unprecedented opportunities and tragic conflicts. The medical explanation for Herod's death, while providing scientific understanding of his condition, does not diminish the symbolic power that his story has maintained across the centuries. Whether viewed as divine punishment for tyrannical behavior, or as a reminder of human mortality and the limits of earthly power, his bizarre and horrible death continues to resonate with audiences who recognize universal themes in his particular tragedy. The accounts of Herod's final illness also provide valuable historical evidence about ancient attitudes toward death, disease, and the relationship between physical and spiritual health. The detailed descriptions left by contemporary observers reveal beliefs about the connection between moral behavior and bodily condition that were central to ancient religious and philosophical thought. For modern readers, the story of Herod's death raises profound questions about justice, mortality, and the meaning of human suffering that transcend the specific historical circumstances of his time and place. His experience of losing all control over his own body while retaining full awareness of his condition speaks to fundamental fears about aging, illness, and death that remain relevant today. The contrast between Herod's former power and his final helplessness also illustrates the fragility of human achievements and the ultimate equality of all people in the face of mortality. No amount of wealth, political influence, or architectural monument could protect him from the bacterial infection that consumed his flesh, reminding us that biological reality ultimately trumps all human pretensions to permanence and control. The psychological torment that accompanied Herod's physical suffering adds another dimension to his story that continues to fascinate modern audiences. The guilt and paranoia that had driven him to commit so many violent acts clearly continued to plague him even as his body failed, suggesting that his mental anguish may have been even worse than his physical pain. In examining Herod's death more than 2 millennia after the fact, we are struck by both the uniqueness of his particular circumstances and the universal themes that his story illustrates. While few people will ever wield the kind of power he possessed or die in such horrific circumstances, everyone must eventually confront questions about mortality, legacy, and the meaning of human existence that his experience brings into sharp focus. The bizarre case of the king who rotted alive ultimately serves as more than just a historical curiosity or medical mystery. It provides a lens through which we can examine fundamental questions about power and its consequences, the relationship between earthly authority and divine justice, and the ultimate futility of trying to control forces that are beyond human comprehension or influence. Herod's story reminds us that no matter how successfully we may seem to shape our circumstances during life, we all remain vulnerable to forces that can strip away our pretensions and reduce us to our essential humanity. His experience of losing everything he had worked to achieve, not through military defeat or political betrayal, but through the simple biological reality of bacterial infection, speaks to the fundamental uncertainty that underlies all human existence. The manner of his death, horrible as it was, also provides a strange kind of democratic lesson about the ultimate equality of all human beings. Kings and commoners, tyrants and saints, all share the same biological vulnerabilities, and all must eventually face the same fundamental questions about meaning and mortality that Herod confronted in his final days. Perhaps most importantly, his story continues to resonate because it addresses timeless concerns about justice and accountability that remain relevant in every generation. Whether or not we believe that his suffering represented divine punishment for his crimes, we can recognize in his experience a powerful illustration of how the consequences of our actions may ultimately catch up with us in ways we never anticipated or imagined. The king who rotted alive thus becomes more than just a historical figure or medical case study. He becomes a symbol of human ambition and its limits, of the price of moral compromise, and of the ultimate futility of trying to escape the consequences of our choices through the accumulation of power and wealth. In the end, Herod the Great died as he had lived, dramatically, controversially, and in ways that continued to influence history long after his mortal remains had been laid to rest. His bizarre and terrible death ensured that he would be remembered not just as a successful politician and ambitious builder, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power and the inevitability of divine justice. The story of his final illness and death remains one of history's most compelling examples of how individual human experiences can illuminate universal truths about mortality, justice, and the human condition. More than 2,000 years after his passing, we continue to find in his story insights about power and its corrupting influence, about guilt and its psychological consequences, and about the ultimate fragility of even the most impressive human achievements. Thus ends the bizarre case of the king who rotted alive, a story that combines historical fact with timeless moral lessons, medical mystery with spiritual significance, and individual tragedy with universal human themes. Herod's death was unique in its particular horror, but the questions it raises about power, mortality, and justice continue to challenge and instruct us today, making his story as relevant now as it was to the ancient observers who first recorded his terrible end.